So that was a presentation by Mrs. Sanjay Manohar, the Managing Director of McAfee India, talking to us about what got us here, wouldn't take us there. And we now move on to our next session, which is also a keynote address. And with us, we have this evening Mr. Paul Melson, Vice President, Cybersecurity Solutions at Target. And Paul will, in fact, be talking to us about practical ransomware defense. And without wasting any time, I'd like to invite on stage now Mr. Paul Melson to talk to all of us.
Good afternoon.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. All right, let us bring up our slides. Hopefully everyone can see those okay?
Yes, you may go ahead.
Excellent. All right, thank you. All right, so I am Paul Melson, Vice President of Cybersecurity for Target. Target is a U.S. retailer with $93 billion in revenue across 1,900 stores and digital, 350,000 team members across 22 countries globally, 4,000 tech workers in the U.S. and India, and our Target in India Global Capability Center has been supporting the business for about 15 years now. But today I'm here really to talk to you about ransomware, kind of the state of events, what has led us up to the place that we are today, and also some practical approaches to defending an enterprise against ransomware. I think if there's one thing I'd like to accomplish with today's keynote, it's just I'd like to bust some myths about what ransomware is and isn't, and whether or not it's something that's an approachable problem. And I'll spoil my summary, which is that yes, I think ransomware is very much something that enterprises can defend against. So before we talk a little bit about how we approach defending that, though, I think it's important to sort of level set on what ransomware is. Now, chances are that you've seen news stories over the last year or so regarding ransomware attacks, maybe headlines like some of these involving tech companies, gas pipelines, food processing and distribution, and many other lines of businesses. But to really understand ransomware, we have to understand what it is at a little bit more technical level. So, ransomware itself, the word is just a portmanteau of the words ransom and software. But ultimately, when we talk about ransomware, what we're talking about is extortion. Attackers encrypt sensitive data, rendering it useless and often causing systems to fail, taking businesses offline. And then the attacker requires a cryptocurrency payment to provide a decryption key in order to recover that data and resume normal business. This form of ransomware, the kind that targets businesses for high-dollar extortion, really began to take off in or around 2018 and has grown every year since then. So why has ransomware become kind of the number one model that we see for trying to monetize cybercrime globally? And really, if we look back to the early 2000s, kind of at the beginning of cybercrime for financial gain, what we see all the way up to about 2018 is that most of the cybercrime has been focused on stealing data that the attacker themselves could monetize, things like credit cards and social security numbers. Ransomware, however, dramatically increases the number of possible victims. If you think about the number of companies that have large volumes of banking information or credit card data, or the ability to move money from one place to another, where an attacker could reasonably access it without fraud controls and law enforcement, that's a really small percentage of enterprises globally. It's still hundreds, but it's just hundreds, right? Ransomware, however, because it can affect manufacturing, transportation, regional and small government, all of a sudden now there are tens of thousands of potential victims. So that's the first thing that ransomware does, is really increase the potential victim pool. The other thing is that ransomware demands can be very large. Sometimes we've seen ransomware demands in the tens of millions of dollars. In fact, the largest one that we've seen to date is $70 million that we know that has been asked. We don't know that that's necessarily what the victim paid, but that's what we know the ask to be. But I think it's reasonable that we could see a ransomware attack that demanded $100 million sometime in the next few months. And it's publicly reported, for instance, that Colonial Pipeline, who's the focus of the headline here on this page, that they paid $5 million to their attackers to unlock their data, right? When we compare that to some of the attacks that we were seeing in the even in the mid 2000 teens, the level of effort compared to the level of gain is dramatically more in favor of the attacker with ransomware. And that's it. It's simple economics versus effort. A ransomware attack doesn't have to involve long-term persistence. They have to get into the environment, they have to take control of the environment, and then they have to seize the environment. Whereas if we were looking at wanting to make, $5 million, let alone $100 million, in order to do that, you've either got to have access to a financial institution that has a lot of money that could go missing and not be noticed, or that has to be a longer intrusion where they sort of bleed money out of the system and hope to not get noticed over time. Either of those is going to require very specific targeting of victims, which can be difficult, or it would require that the intrusion go on unnoticed for a very long period of time, which is getting harder and harder for attackers to do. Ransomware obviously is a solve for this problem for the attackers. So here we are in 2021, and ransomware attacks have really become a daily occurrence. But I think that they're misunderstood a lot, right? At least in the news media, it feels like there have only been a couple of key disruptive attacks, right? A few attacks on healthcare. Obviously, here in the U.S., the gas pipeline and some of the food distribution stuff have been big headlines. There have been some attacks, in India that have impacted retail and food service and tech companies. But the reality of the situation is this is a thing that is happening on a daily basis, right? The cadence that these attackers are able to maintain allows them to even a single ransomware group can take down, and encrypt dozens of victims in the course of a single week. And obviously with multiple groups out there, this leads to literally hundreds a month of actual victims in the wild. So I think some of the misconceptions and some of what we're going to talk about coming up, really understanding these myths and being able to dispel them is important. And knowing, where we sort of started with ransomware and that this isn't something that has just exploded on the scene in the last year. So first, let's talk about that. The number one conception, ransomware is a new problem. Ransomware actually goes back quite a while, but the original model of encrypting somebody's data and then asking them to pay for it started as a single opportunistic attack that would be deployed via an automatic exploitation chain, right? So usually an email attachment, person clicks the email attachment, triggers the malware installs, and instead of waiting around hoping to be able to steal banking credentials or whatever Trojan this attacker might have used previously, they encrypt all of your vacation photos and ask you to pay $100 to get them back. Novel, but not highly profitable, but also not hands on keyboard, not very interactive as an intrusion goes. In 2016 or so, we start to see volume-based self-spreading viruses. We also see those same pieces of ransomware that were being used to target individual workstations now take the opportunity to start looking for things like network shares and so on to encrypt those in hopes of causing maybe a business or an enterprise to pay. And I think that becomes sort of the first spark in the thought of going after large companies, probably because there were payments made back then, but those were less visible, much harder to track. And then in around 2018, we start to see big game hunting. Now, I'll be blunt and say that the majority of the activity that we see comes out of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the actual short story is that a group of Iranian hackers, sometimes called SAMSA or SamSam, developed this model originally, where they would break into a system, deploy their ransomware, and demand their payment, and they would be encrypting hundreds of computers simultaneously. The effectiveness of this particular attack method was noticed by some of the other more capable cyber gangs, and basically they took that over. And so let's talk about misconception number 2, which is that ransomware is a nation-state tradecraft. Now, cybersecurity professionals are definitely going to be familiar with WannaCry and NotPetya. Those were major attacks, highly disruptive. And while it's true that a small number of these disruptive attacks were designed to appear as ransomware and were, in fact, carried out by nation-states to either punish a political adversary or to cover the tracks of another intrusion, this is really rare. The vast majority of the ransomware attacks that you're seeing today, regardless of the net effect or who the victim is, most of them are being perpetrated by criminal groups working in organized teams. Even attacks on government systems, largely perpetrated by criminals. So, and ransomware as a service and the affiliate profit sharing model that a lot of these groups like Ryuk and Revil and so on have adopted allows them to specialize to get faster, but also if there's a disruption or a problem with one of the operators or actors, they can quickly reconnect and keep an operation going in terms of the actual access to talent, I suppose would be the word. And another thing to note about this is that these are not new groups, right? They didn't mature overnight. They didn't come up in just a couple of years. In fact, we can track a lot of these groups. So looking at groups like Ryuk and DarkSide in particular, track their roots back to groups like Fin6 or Fin7, sometimes also known as Carbonac, who were previously focused on banking and credit card data, right? So some of these groups have been around over a decade and have just pivoted into ransomware because of the money they can make. And finally, misconception number 3 with ransomware is that the disruption, the encryption of data is the only incentive to pay. Now, for sure, the encryption of a large chunk of a business network is going to be highly disruptive and shut a business down. And unfortunately, that can have catastrophic consequences for the business and, depending on the entity, the people that it serves. But we see a number of other things that go with this, and we're seeing the attackers iterate on and get creative with the different ways that they try and apply pressure. Because like I said at the beginning, ultimately what they're trying to do is extort money from their victims. So we also see very commonly exfiltration of sensitive data and then threats of blackmail to release that information to the public, to the news, to the victim organization's potential enemies or rivals as part of pressure to play. The other thing that we see too is the use of leak sites and tipping off the media on the part of the actors, right? It's really interesting to watch some of the threat actors go out of their way to reach out to the media and try and get reporters on the case in order to try and apply public pressure on the victim to hurry up and end the attack by paying the ransom. And there are a few other things that we've seen as well. We've seen some experimentation with denial of service attacks to try and further disrupt operations. And I think we'll continue to see some iteration and some level of creativity there as they continue to try and find ways to keep the pressure up on victims. Now let's talk real quick about the 2 things that are sort of the key enablers of ransomware. Now, I'm not taking a stand on cryptocurrency, but what I will say is that Bitcoin, Monero, cryptocurrency really is an enabler for the ransomware victim or for the ransomware operators, right? Payments are done using Bitcoin, and they're harder for law enforcement to track and disrupt, but not impossible, as we saw over the summer. But without cryptocurrency, ransomware is a lot less profitable. Trying to move money, gained as a result of committing a crime through the international financial system, there are a lot of opportunities for that to be stopped, or in order to get it down to a level where the payment might go undetected, now all of a sudden ransomware attackers would have to, accept thousands of dollars as opposed to millions of dollars. It's a dramatic difference in terms of what they can make as a result of using cryptocurrency for payment. Also, as I spoke about earlier, certainly not exclusively, but the majority of, and certainly the most sophisticated ransomware attacks that we see today are being perpetrated by Russian-speaking organized crime rings that are operating out of former Soviet countries in the Commonwealth of Independent States. This part of the world has been a hotbed for financial computer crimes for, going back almost 15 years. And because these countries rarely cooperate with Western law enforcement agencies, the criminals can operate fairly openly without having to worry about, repercussions from law enforcement. Although we have seen some really neat stuff in 2021 coming out of Europol and cooperation with the Ukraine National Police, where some arrests have been effective. But where, countries like Belarus and Russia are concerned, though, the actors that are living there still seem to be beyond the reach of law enforcement, at least for the time being. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about how we defend against ransomware attacks. Ransomware attacks, just like any other cyber attack, follow a prescribed kill chain. The attackers gain initial access, they establish persistence, and then they have to execute their objective. Ransomware is not the beginning. In fact, it is the means and it is the end of the attack. So fundamentally, the things you would do to prevent an initial cyber intrusion, like preventing foothold through phishing prevention, team member training, implementing multi-factor authentication, building your incident response and detection capabilities, being able to see and evict attackers from your network, all of these things that we've been building up capabilities in the cybersecurity space around are effective against ransomware attackers. So, and ultimately, this has been a key piece of Target's strategy. I will tell you what I think our secret sauce is really speed. The ability to detect and respond quickly to the early phases of an attack and evict the attacker before they have the opportunity to set up shop, gain privilege in the environment, long before it would be profitable or make sense for them to be able to deploy ransomware within the environment. A key piece of this for us is our Global Capability Center based in Bangalore, India. And this is a big part of our incident response team's follow the sun model. Full capability for vulnerability management, testing, detection, incident response, intelligence, all based in both the US and India so that we can perform fast response as a team, regardless of time of day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So with that, as I'm looking at where we sit coming out of that, the other thing to think about when it comes to ransomware attacks is really looking at how we prepare the environment from a resiliency perspective. So thinking about what our crisis management and communication strategies are going to be, preparing leadership for doing tabletops with, and getting ready to talk about what happens should that bad day happen. How do we maintain the continuity of our business so that we're financially, in a safe space to continue to try and recover from an attack like that. So those are some of the things to think about as we prepare for and get ready to face ransomware. But ultimately, what I hope I've been able to do is dispel some of the myths about what ransomware is and really how you can fight back against it using the same tactics and capabilities that you've been working with in cybersecurity for at least the last decade. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for having me to DSCI this afternoon. And I think we are set to open for a question and answer, if I'm not mistaken.